So, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the next of our winter lecture series. My name is Santino. I'm the education coordinator for the Preserve, and I am so thrilled to have with us Ben Pfeiffer, who is founder of the Firefly Conservation and Research Project, who will be talking to us all about the fireflies of America here. So before we get started, is this anyone's first Bowman's Wildflower Preserve experience? Let us know if you're doing that here in person, or if you're joining us virtually, you can pop that info down in the chat. Let us know how you heard about the program, what you're excited about. And if you're watching this as a recording, pop that in the chat as well, down in the comments below. I got to give a special shout out and thanks to the Bucks County Foundation for their generous support of this program. And if this does happen to be your first Bowman's Wildflower Preserve program, a quick intro to the preserve before we get started. We were founded back in 1934. Two visionary individuals are to thank for that: Mary Kay Perry, who is chairman of the Bucks County Federation of Women's Club, and W. Wilson Heintish, who is employed by the Pennsylvania Department of Forest and Waters. They had a vision of a place where people could enjoy Pennsylvania native plant splendor all year round. And after heavy championing in October of 1934, they got the commission to set aside a 100-acre portion of Washington Crossing Historic Park as a living memorial to the patriots of George Washington's army who were camped there during the Revolutionary War. And that's how we got our start. If we fast forward, the 1950s is when volunteers first began giving wildflower tours of the preserve, which is a tradition that you can still enjoy today. During the growing season of April through October, on Fridays through Mondays, over the weekend, we offer guided wildflower walks. In the 1960s is when our visitor center first got built. If you're joining us in person, you can see that it has not changed much since then. The 1970s, we became a 501c3 nonprofit member-supported organization. So it's at this point of every program, I like to take my hat off, both proverbially and really, to our members. We couldn't do what we do without your support. So thank you all so much for that. In the 1980s, we became the nation's only accredited botanical museum dedicated to native plants. So if you visit the preserve, it's one of the coolest things, I think, is that we're not just a nature center. We are not just a wildlands. No, we are an accredited botanical museum. So think Metropolitan Museum of Art, think Natural History Museum, think Smithsonian. We have that same museum accreditation, but we are not. We don't have artifacts, bones, or the like paintings. No, our collection is a living and respiring collection of nearly 750 different native species on site, which means that there is always something to see at any point of the year. And if you're only looking for blooms, it is very common for us, or at least in the more recent years, for us to have witch hazel ending as skunk cabbage is starting to bloom. So I'm happy and terrified to say that we have blooms all year round. If you're joining us in person, this is a great time to turn off or silence your cell phones so that you don't disturb us or others. If you're joining us virtually, also turn off your cell phone, though you'll only bother whoever's in the room with you. If you're joining us in person and need to use the restroom, know they're located back outside to the right. If you're joining us virtually, they are wherever they are in your house. If you're joining us here in person, please feel free to help yourself to coffee and cookies. And if you're joining us from home, whatever you got in your fridge or cupboard. Questions here at the end of the program. I'll be passing around this microphone so that Ben can hear y'all. And if you're joining us virtually, I'll be asking those questions on your behalf. And I think that's it. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to all of you, virtually for everyone, because Ben is not here in the room with us, but Ben Pfeiffer is the founder of the Firefly Conservation and Research at firefly.org, a nonprofit dedicated to firefly conservation and education. He's a well-known public speaker and science educator working to document the diversity of fireflies in Texas, as well as their natural history, including their life cycle, preferred habitat, and unique flash patterns. His research is helping to illuminate the state's incredible rich firefly diversity so that others can work to preserve and enjoy it. He studied biology at Texas State University and is a certified master naturalist. He is a sixth-generation Texan who has spent most of his life working to understand Texas ecology and its unique diversity. Ben, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on this all important of Sundays. Hopefully you'll have time to get back to the big game. And without further ado, I guess I should say the virtual space is all yours.
Awesome. Well, Santino, thanks so much for the nice introduction. I am very happy to speak to y'all today. I hope to educate y'all on fireflies across the United States, specifically kind of focused on the Southwest area, and then just kind of help you identify particular species that you might find in your area. So like Santino said, if you'll just silence your cell phones, it's just helpful while I'm talking. That'll be great. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to post that in the chat. I'll open up about a 10-15 minute question and answer section that we can ask questions. You can ask questions and then I'll answer them. There's going to be some interesting information that I'll present and that might spur some kind of cool questions. No question is off limits in terms of whether you think it's dumb or not. So just please let me know. Happy to answer it. Like Santino said, I'm based in Texas. My research is focused primarily on Southwest and Texas species. Many of the species that we have here in Texas also are very similar to the ones that you'll find in Pennsylvania and across the mid-Atlantic. They're all in the same genus. And so we're going to walk through quite a few of them and just kind of help you to understand why fireflies occur and why they're also declining. And so let's go ahead and get started. So just to start off with some basics, I just kind of like to frame what actually fireflies are. And fireflies are beetles. And in Texas and many other places, they go by lightning bugs, firefly, or that glowy thing over there. You might have some name that you might have called them when you were growing up. But they are beetles, and they occur in the order Coleoptera, which contains over 400,000 species worldwide. So that is an incredibly diverse group. Of that group, there's very few actual insects that actually bioluminesce. And so our subject of the presentation today is going to be talking about fireflies, and it's one of those unique insects that actually will luminesce. Now, all fireflies belong to what's called the family Lampyridae. Now, that's going to be helpful as we go along in the presentation today, because I'm going to talk about some different characteristics that make up why fireflies are in the family Lampyridae. Beetles in the family Lampyridae share several shared characteristics or features. They all bioluminesce. So you might not know, but fireflies bioluminesce as adults and as juveniles, and that's one of the requirements for being in this family. They all have relatively soft, elongated bodies. We sometimes like to call these squishy beetles, because if you've ever come across a beetle, it usually has a hard exoskeleton, but fireflies are generally kind of soft, and so they kind of get the squishy beetle moniker. They have a flattened shield that covers the back of their head. This stuff will be more important as we go along. But if you look to the right of your screen, you'll see a firefly that has kind of a orange and a kind of a reddish shield on the back of its head, and that's what we call the pronotum. It has rather large eyes that kind of telescope in and out. And that head shield that I mentioned basically is usually pretty large and has various colorings or markings on it. Some fireflies will have a black spot. Sometimes it'll be a blob or kind of a triangle. And that's very diagnostic sometimes for us firefly scientists to help identify species. Fireflies are about 5 to 20 millimeters long. They can get up to even larger than that. To give you a good example, if you were to go to the Amazon in South America, you might find fireflies that are 45 millimeters long, a couple inches or more. And so those are gigantic kind of things. Here in the United States, primarily they kind of cap out about 25 millimeters. So think about an inch, a little over an inch or more. This is just a little bit of firefly anatomy, just helpful to kind of understand what actually makes up a firefly. There are a lot of insects that occur in nature that actually mimic fireflies, because fireflies are poisonous to most species of predators like birds and bats. And so sometimes you'll come across an insect and you'll be like, oh, that looks like a firefly. But in fact, it's just a mimic. And so one of the things that we like to do is just kind of talk about a little bit about some of the features that fireflies have. They obviously have this head shield here. They have 11 antenna segments, and then they have this pronotal spot that's also helpful. They have what's called a scutellum, which is a kind of a hard bony plate that separates the abdomen and the elytra or the wing covers from the head shield. And then the wing covers, or the elytra as they're called, typically are black or yellow. In this case, this firefly here has a yellow margin around its wing covers. We call this the elytral margin. And that's just helpful for us because some species just are all black, and it's just helpful for us to identify species. So this is a picture of the difference between a female firefly and a male firefly. Now, off the bat, you might recognize some differences, besides the fact that they look kind of similar. The female on the left has kind of a translucent, creamy yellow kind of area, and that's her light organ. And she only has one light organ, and it's rather reduced, basically. The male has two light organs that you see. So if you ever find a firefly, and the season's going to be coming up relatively pretty soon, turn it over and see what kind of species it is. Not species, but gender it is. Females are kind of the future of the population. So those are ones that we want to replace back into the habitat and definitely protect as best we can. But this will give you a good idea of how to identify between males and females. Diversity of fireflies. I'm speaking specifically about Texas here, but in Pennsylvania and parts of the central eastern United States, there's about 35 species that occur, and potentially more. Worldwide, there is a good number of about 2,000 species, and that's quite large. For example, a couple of years ago, they identified a new species in Iran, of all places. So new species are kind of being identified on a regular basis. Stuff in South America and Mexico are pretty hotbeds, and the United States still has some species as well. We've got about 180 to 200 United States species, with some overlap of stuff that occurs from Mexico into Texas kind of area. To give you a little bit of kind of comparison, Florida has the highest number of firefly species with around 45, 50 plus. Then goes Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama, and some of the southern states. Once you get up to some of the other states, kind of up towards Maine and stuff like that, in the Midwest, the species count starts to decline a little bit. Some firefly basics in terms of life cycle. What a lot of people don't know is that fireflies spend most of their life in the larval state, and they'll spend about 1 to 2 years in that basically state. Off to the left lower corner is what a larva of a firefly looks like. Kind of looks like this prehistoric kind of worm that crawls along the ground. But as adults, they really only live for about 3 to 4 weeks, and it's a rather short time. Their mission during that time is obviously to mate and sire more offspring, and then the female will lay eggs. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see a larva that just hatched from an egg. Now, if you look closely at the bottom of that larva is kind of a whitish bright spot at the end of its tail. And so that is a larva that's glowing, basically just hatching from the egg. Now, the eggs will also glow too, but this goes back to some of the shared characteristics that I talked about in terms of as larvae, as adolescents, they need to glow as well as adults. So firefly habitat. Fireflies are very habitat specific. They love warm, humid areas, as we might expect. They're generally found on riparian areas or riparian corridors. And these are areas that occur along a river or stream and a land. And basically a riparian corridor is that interface between the land and the river. It's usually that rich vegetation layer that occurs right at the water's edge, essentially. It's only about 1% of all land types. And so it's a very rare type, and it's one that needs to be mostly protected. And as you guessed, fireflies like moisture, of course, and so they like rivers, ponds, and streams and wetlands. And then some species also occur a little bit outside of that corridor, that border, in kind of nearby areas, and they can handle more xeric conditions as well. So firefly flash patterns. To most people, fireflies kind of look like they flash the same. But really, each firefly species has its own distinct firefly flash pattern. The image off to the right on the presentation shows an example of different flashes that you might come across for fireflies in the evening. Now, during the evening, there might be more than one species occurring in a habitat, especially if it's a really rich habitat. This chart, an image shows basically a diversity of flash patterns here. And you'll also notice that they also occur at different heights within the habitat. So you have fireflies at like number 1 that flashes up at the top, and you have fireflies that flash towards the kind of the margins and top of the grass there. Flash patterns differ in a variety of different ways. If it's hotter outside, the faster they'll flash. If it's colder, the slower they'll flash. The color for the genus of fireflies can also vary as well. You can have a kind of a yellowish green kind of flash compared to one from the genus Pyractomina that's kind of amber colored, for example. The number of flashes varies as well. Sometimes they might flash in intervals of 1 second delays between each flash. Sometimes you might get a quick triple flash or double flash situation. And sometimes there'll be really quick flashes. The time of night that they're active also, the flash patterns will differ as well. As the night progresses, a little more desperate that the males get, basically, and sometimes the faster that they'll flash. So I put this in here just because it's kind of interesting, and I'm not going to go over too much, but how do they light up, and why do they light up? Well, this is the chemical formula for how fireflies illuminate, and they use a substance called luciferin, which is a pigment, and then luciferase, which is an enzymatic catalyst, and of course ADP. If you remember back from biology class, it's ADP is a nucleotide that provides energy to the cells. We have it, they have it. When luciferin is combined with oxygen and inside the luciferin molecule, it converts to oxyluciferin, and then a couple other different substances, and then you get light. And essentially how it works is that off to the right is the luciferase enzyme. And to just make it super simple to understand it, basically inside of it is luciferin. And as fireflies breathe in oxygen, this molecule in the center, in the yellowish green area, basically gets highly excited or charges up with those oxygen ions. When it can't hold any more oxygen, basically it releases those oxygen ions, and that produces visible light. And so you can kind of think of it like miniature lightning in a way, as those molecules that are in the light organs of firefly, they kind of charge up basically, and if you look really closely under a microscope at it, that's what it looks like. So the molecule does this and it recharges over and over, and that's how you get light. Colors of light can vary as well. I'll just touch on this briefly, but it's just kind of fun. Luciferin can vary in terms of its structure, and that structure difference basically with the molecule can produce different colors of light. So you can get yellowish green, yellow, all the way to red, basically. And then the light differences based on the time of night, what the firefly is doing, and then also what you see as well, too. When I got started many years ago, I started seeing fireflies way off in the distance that displayed a kind of a white light, for example. And I was like, well, that's really curious. That fireflies just has like white light. Why isn't it a color? And so I kind of thought about this for a while and looked into it. And what turned out was that the firefly was so far away that the rods in my eyes, the cones in my eyes that were picking up green, for example, weren't able to pick up that green spectrum because it was so weak. So what I was seeing was white light when in fact the firefly was signaling green. So just keep in mind when you are looking out in the night that your eyes might betray you somewhat in terms of what you're seeing. So why do fireflies flash in the first place? What are they doing? How do they choose a mate? And so flying males basically broadcast signals as they search for females, and that's what the flash patterns are for. Females, though, on the other hand, are looking for specific intraspecific variations in male flash timing. So this is subtle differences in how males flash. Now, I usually ask the question, and I'm going to ask the question, what do you think that female fireflies like in male fireflies? If you have any ideas, feel free to post that in the chat or the question and answer section. And so what do female fireflies like and male fireflies? I was giving this presentation one time recently, and there was a woman in the front, and she just started chuckling, and she raised her hand. And when I asked the question, and she says, I know what female fireflies like and males, and she says a sense of humor. And it was pretty funny. I don't know if females like a sense of humor or not, but it was great. But what they do like is longer flashes or faster flash rates. Sometimes these features signal the fitness or the health of a male, and female might choose this because it might increase the odds of desiring more offspring. So how are fireflies helpful? Generally, they act as nature's pest control. The larvae are very predaceous. They just consume constantly. And so they eat snails and earthworms and dead insects on the forest floor. And then some adult fireflies also eat insects and even their own kind. And so they kind of act as nature's pest control. When you have a lot of pests in the environment, sometimes those things can get out of whack, as you know. And this is one way nature uses to control that. They act as a really good indicator of the health of an environment. Larvae spend a lot of time in the mud and in the leaf litter on the forest floor. And so this is a good place. This is a place that can get polluted relatively pretty easily, especially in kind of a wetland area or anywhere that's connected with moisture. And so generally they act as a good health indicator for the health of an environment. If you come across an habitat that's got 4 or 5 species splashing at the same time, you can just basically bet that that is a robust, fully functioning habitat that is not in decline. They're medically useful as well. They're used in food safety research and cancer research and the development of new drugs, specifically using luciferin and luciferase. They use synthetic chemicals in order to light up if a drug works or if there's a presence of a bacteria, for example. So are fireflies disappearing? A lot of my research has been focused on studying this for the last decade. And I used to, when I talk about this, basically say there's only really anecdotal evidence to kind of support this. But now, as of today, we have empirical evidence to kind of support the decline of fireflies across the United States specifically. And there's good consensus between the public and scientific communities that there's a whole lot fewer fireflies than there used to be. You might all remember a time when you were younger or when you were a kid when you're catching fireflies, and you might particular areas where you saw a lot more of them, and you see them less now. Some of that is we don't go outside at night as much as we used to. People are inside a lot in the evenings now, watching Netflix and a variety of different other things, and generally just afraid of the dark. So in combination of that plus the decline, it's led to a lot of that kind of consensus. But the empirical evidence is there. About 14% of North American firefly species, around 18 species, are either threatened or classified as critically endangered, or vulnerable. And so, for example, here in Texas, we have several species that are definitely in vulnerable classification, and then one that's potentially or more that are endangered. What we do know is that there's a really urgent need for conservation of their habitats. So just like at the preserve where you guys are at right now, somebody thought, very far ahead to preserve that particular land for future generations. And it's basically acting as a arc or a hedge against decline around it. And so we need more of these places to protect those habitats. Fireflies are very uniquely adapted to their local habitat. And so what we really want to protect are unique locally adapted species. So these are species that might occur only in your area, for example, and not like the common type of firefly. So let's talk a little bit about why they're disappearing, because that's an important topic in terms of why they're disappearing and what we can do. So one of the reasons that they're declining is pollution, for example, and then loss of riparian corridors. Now, this image is showing a spring-fed creek near the border of Texas and Mexico in Del Rio, for example. Del Rio's been a lot in the news with the immigrants coming over, but what's less known for people from outside the area is that it actually has a lot of spring-fed creeks and rivers, and it's home to the last pristine river in Texas. This is an area that's nearby, and it's just a great image showing the problem. You have pollution from trash, and then behind him, where this kid is standing, is basically a reed bank, basically. Now, at one point, 100 years ago, this was a natural habitat with a diverse amount of species. But what's been replaced is with a species called carrizo cane. And what it is just a large cane from Africa that has created a monoculture. Now, and the point is that, like, if you're a firefly female and you're along the bank's edge of a creek or area, and you're trying to flash to a male that's higher up in the trees, this dense, basically cane kind of prevents that from happening. She can't see him and he can't get to her. And so no fireflies are able to mate, basically, and they go away. So a very simple but poignant reminder of like the loss of riparian corridors around. Across the United States, you know, a large chunk of rivers and streams are polluted or in decline in some form or fashion. Obviously, there's those ones that are protected, but this is a big area, especially around cities. Habitat loss and degradation, land clearing. I live in a part of Texas that is one of the fastest growing in the entire United States, the corridor between San Antonio and Austin. And basically, in the last 10 years, basically you just see like it disappear, any kind of natural remnants replaced with subdivision stuff. The stuff basically displaces them. So this is one of the reasons. Light pollution is another one. You can see an example of how light pollution's increased over the last 100 years as artificial light has increased. And the real problem with light pollution is that the light basically gets in the way of males seeing females. If you're a female on the ground signaling to a male and there's a bright street lamp with a white LED light, for example, that's shining in your area, that white light is going to wash out your yellowish, more narrow spectrum light. And so they just can't see each other. And so if they can't see each other, they can't mate, and there's no fireflies. Pesticide usage is another one. Anything that's broad spectrum that's targeted towards like beetle kill, for example. Well, fireflies are beetles, so this pesticide, this lawn pesticide would kill them. So kind of pesticides that are non-targeted, for example, are a big problem, specifically lawn pesticides and those that are water soluble. Disappearing water tables is another one. Drought and then aquifer decline in particular areas is an issue. In many places, there used to be like, you know, the aquifers used to be relatively pretty full, and they would basically sprout seeps in areas, and that would create a consistent amount of moisture. But as you know, these particular aquifers have been pumped around the nation. A lot of those particular areas that used to be wet, that harbored some species or diversity, basically have kind of dried up, and those species have disappeared. So how to help? One of the ways that you can do that, if you're a gardener, you can assess your soil health. So poor soil kind of equals poor habitat for firefly food. So think about snails and worms. They need a place to live too. These are the things that fireflies eat. And if you've got poor soil, it's poor habitat for the food that fireflies eat. If you want to improve your soil, consider adding amendments to it to introduce nutrients. You can also till your soil very lightly as well. Maybe you don't need to go down super deep, but you can till it lightly. What this does is this allows for moisture and nutrients to enter the soil to enrich it, basically. One of a cool story is that there's actually fireflies that occur in Manhattan in Central Park, believe it or not. And one of the ways that they maintain those fireflies there is that they create little beds that they plant nothing in. And they're basically just soil beds. And what this does is they till that soil yearly to allow females to lay eggs in it. And basically this allows for the fireflies to lay those eggs and then the fireflies to be born again. and just a great way that somebody figured out in order to keep fireflies in an urban area. Broad spectrum pesticides we talked about. You can turn off outside lights, and then you can advocate for adopting local policies to control light pollution, specifically for lights that point downward and not like broadcast in all areas. The best way is to contact your city government to suggest dark sky policies. There are many outdated light pollution ordinances across the nation, and the best way you can do this is urge your city council or your particular area to adopt some very light dark sky policies. You don't have to go overboard with it, but you can just recommend to say, hey, as humans, we don't like light pollution shining in our eyes at night. Fireflies won't like it either. Maybe we'd like to be able to see the stars at night. You can buy land to protect species. This is a great one if you're able to do it. This is a very effective one because you're able to control and do some land management tactics that can help fireflies. You can become certified. You can certify your land as a firefly habitat, for example, and I'll talk about that briefly. You can let log and leaf litter accumulate, plant trees and native grasses. Grasses and forbs help retain soil moisture. I have a list on my website at firefly.org that talks about plants for fireflies. So if you're interested in planting for fireflies in your area, you can consider looking at that. Don't overmow your lawn, and consider doing some pollinator or restore prairies, for example, and educate your neighbors is a great one. So to certify your habitat, firefly habitat, signs are now available. This past year, I created the first of its kind certification program for firefly habitat. It's a self-directed program, and it focuses on 4 main areas of importance. So cover for firefly larvae and adults, increase plant diversity, reduce light pollution, and restricting pesticide usage. It comes with a helpful guide. The sign's inexpensive, and it's basically there to help identify habitats that need to be protected. So if you know somebody who might be interested in this would be a great gift for them, or for a particular preserve or habitat that that has firefly area. This would be a great sign to help that out. And you can find that on firefly.org/certify, or click on the certify button on the homepage. So I'm going to walk you through some habitat in Texas. You might see some similarities between your local area, but this is just kind of a great walkthrough. I do this in presentations because sometimes other people aren't able to get out to see certain places. But this will just educate us on what we want to look for when we're looking for firefly habitat. This is an interesting place in Texas called Enchanted Rock in Gillespie County. And what it's known for is a large granite monolith that occurs. It's very popular, very beautiful. And what you can see here is a kind of an ephemeral stream. And the ephemeral stream is ones that only flow seasonally during rainfall events, basically. But this habitat encourages fireflies. And you can see on either side of the bank here, some nice vegetation that's occurring. Lots of nice flowers, native grasses. We have some prickly pear cactus dominated by live oak and mesquite. So just a pretty habitat. This is another habitat that occurs in Jeff Davis County in far west Texas. So if you ever wanted to know what a big game ranch in West Texas looks like that harbors fireflies, this is it. There's maple trees growing in here out in the middle of West Texas. So just a remarkable place. And it harbors some a very interesting species of fireflies. This is a cypress kind of bottomland, kind of marshy habitat that occurs in Guadalupe County, near the county I live. And you can see this has very tall trees, and at night it creates an extremely dark habitat. And this is a spring-fed river, really beautiful. And the fireflies like to congregate in the very, very, very dark areas in the foreground. This is another area in Central Texas, near Austin, actually. I put this in here because this is a landowner that had spent the last 15 years restoring a particular patch of property, several acres, to add as many like native species of plants as they could. And they went to great lengths to find every quirky little unknown species of plant they could. And what ended up happening was the restoration of this property created a phenomenal firefly habitat. The landowner used to tell me that when they first got the property, they used to have a lot of water in this creek here. And I said, well, that's great, you know, get some water. And then he was like, yeah, over time the water started to disappear. And I was like, well, that kind of sucks. Like, why did that happen? He's like, oh, well, that's simple. Since all this grass, and you can see this lush vegetation on the sides, basically when the water came downstream, instead of flowing away from the property, the plants on either side were able to soak that water in and retain the moisture on the land. So basically they were able to capture a lot more of the land, the water. And so really kind of cool thing. They also deer fenced this property too, so no deer could get in. So I'm going to talk about Texas species here, but a lot of these will have very similarities to what occurs in your area as well. In Texas, there's 45 species. These are some of the names. Some of these species here in Phyturus versicolor occur in your area. Pyractomina, for example, as well. Angulata, borealis, those are species that occur in your state. Photinus pyralis occurs in your state as well. Photinus fireflies are kind of the most common genera in Texas and the Southwest, about 15-20 species. And this includes the big common dipper, Big Dipper firefly, Photinus pyralis, that is in your area and probably right outside your door this coming spring. And it's most numerous in the early evening. For us Texans, this is one of the only genera that occurs both in spring and fall. And so you might say, Ben, that's interesting. You have fireflies in the spring and the fall. It's like, yes, we have 2 seasons of fireflies, actually. And in some cases, just like at the preserve, we can see fireflies almost year round, almost 12 months out of the year here, with maybe the exception of January, if you look close enough. Photinus pyralis, this occurs in your area. This is kind of ubiquitous across the United States, all the way up from New York, Vermont, all the way down to Texas, and even some spots in New Mexico, for example. Photinus pyralis is known for the black spot on its head. In Texas, we oftentimes have the type that lacks that black spot. A researcher years ago did some unique genetic research comparing the 2 fireflies between those that occur, let's say, in Pennsylvania and the ones that occur in Texas. And what she found was that they are they're genetically a little bit unique. Basically, if on a scale of 0 to 1 being a completely new species, it's right in the middle at 0.5. And so Photinus pyralis has been on a evolutionary journey for many years, kind of trying to become something different here. Whereas in Pennsylvania, it's kind of its separate thing. Now they could still both mate with each other likely, but they are very adapted to their local environment. This firefly has a flash of 4 to 6 seconds between flashes, and it makes a distinctive J shape, as you can see here in the lower left-hand corner. Photinus concisus is a locally adapted species that we have. The only difference between this one is that it flashes every 2 seconds as opposed to every 4 seconds. And the females respond a lot faster. I'm going to show you a video of a firefly's flashing. This is actually in Travis County, and what it's showing is some synchrony of flashes, actually. What a lot of people don't know is that we actually have fireflies that do synchronize their flash intermittently in peak seasons. And it's kind of a rare phenomena to encounter. I've seen it many times, and I was able to get this video. We sent this video off to get analyzed to a professor at Purdue University who ran it through an algorithm in a supercomputer, who then was able to analyze the peaks, and it came out that it was very similar to Photinus carolinus, which occurs in Tennessee, the synchronous fireflies. So I'll go ahead and play this. So if you were watching, you probably noticed some synchrony going on, and the species that was making this was the one I had talked about previously, was Photinus concisus. And so this is what the firefly looks like that made that. So some wonderful pictures by my friend Mike Quinn, basically showing this firefly here. You can see this one's kind of in the medium range here, probably about 15 to 12 millimeters in size. This is what a female looks like. And she's got kind of that one light organ is there as well. Now, this is a fun video. This is going to show some really cool things. So a lot of people aren't able to see the courtship flash sequence between a male and a female firefly. But what this video will show you what that's like. Now, we'll go ahead and start the video, and I'll describe it kind of at the end. But just pay attention to the two flashes that are going on. So what's going on here is that the first flash that you saw, that right there is the male, and then the female is the second flash that's showing basically. And so this is showing the kind of them signaling to each other. Now, what I didn't tell you when I started the video was that I kind of played a trick on them for science, essentially. I separated them between pieces of coffee filter paper. So they weren't able to basically kind of connect with each other, because once they basically connect and start kind of mating, essentially, then they don't flash anymore. So I wanted to delay it long as I possibly could. But not to fear, they were able to eventually meet each other, and they sailed off into the sunset. But it's just a good example, and just a neat idea that I had to do this so I could get this video. And what I really wanted to show here in the study was basically the flash delay time. And it was 0.6 seconds essentially. And this would tell me a little bit about the species and that they can occur. Now, another interesting thing was that the female and the male in here were caught between 200 miles apart. So they were caught in Comal County, and then the other one was caught in Val Verde County along the border. And so these are fireflies that occurred 200 miles apart. And it was an example of trying to see if they could possibly mate to see if they were the same species or not. And it turns out they probably are. This is another species, Photinus stellaris. This is a smaller type of fireflies. These are also, this species not present in your area, but you have the same type of firefly in your area as well, these smaller Photinus. And they occur, and they kind of have fast flashes, 1 second or so. This is what a Photinus stellaris female looks like. This is a kind of a larval form female. These occur in your area as well, and just rather curious. She does not have wings, as you can see, or they're very reduced wings, essentially is what they are. She can't fly, and she can only crawl along the ground, and she's very focused on egg production. So this is just some kind of facts that are put in here, but this female had never been photographed before in 100 years since it was described. So when I found it, it was kind of like the first image of it ever, and we're currently writing a scientific paper on it. But what's interesting is she picks the largest and most vivid males, and since they're so small, about the size of a grain of rice, it takes them a really long time to find each other. This is an example of what the fireflies look like next to each other, just so you can see a size comparison. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so fun question. What do you think likes to eat fireflies? If you have any guesses, post it in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that. Oh, somebody said bats. Okay, bats. All right, more bats. Other fireflies. Okay, Barb said spiders. Okay, small owls. All right, that's cool. You know, it's interesting. I spend a lot of time studying fireflies out in the evening, and I get used to a time frame between like 7:30 and 10 o'clock at night. And my most common friends in the evening are owls, actually, and spiders and bats and armadillos. And so they're always out. And in some cases, they'll be in the same habitat. You'll have fireflies, owls that will be swooping down with bats and armadillos running through your feet. So it's quite cool. But yeah, so what's the answer? So this is an interesting photo that is supposed to give a hint, basically, but something got stuck in something, and what happened was it started to flash because it was caught up in something, and a firefly saw it far away and thought that it was a female, and it came in to inspect. So it zoomed in, landed on what it thought it was a female, and then fell. And this is a very rare photo, but what that was a spider. Jumping spiders and different various web orb spiders are a big predator for fireflies, believe it or not. Bats tend to not eat them, and I talked with Merlin Tuttle for at Bat Conservation International several years ago, and we kind of worked it out, and basically you know, bats will predate on a firefly, but they usually always spit it out because they're very distasteful. So they have to learn not to eat fireflies, interestingly enough. Now, unfortunately, owls tend to be really big, and so they generally kind of aren't interested in them. Now, I've had situations where I've been in a habitat along a really beautiful area, fireflies are flashing, and right over my head is like some pygmy owls, for example. And these elf pygmy owls basically were kind of flying around, and I don't know if they were eating fireflies or not, but could potentially. Birds tend to avoid fireflies because they're distasteful as well. But yeah, spiders and other insects are kind of a big predator. Lastly, Photuris fireflies. These are present in your area under Photuris versicolor and a variety of different other names. Some of you might have heard of Lynn Faust. She is responsible for identifying Photinus carolinus in Tennessee. She's a good friend of mine, and she wrote a really excellent field guide that I would highly encourage anybody to get, especially in your area. And she did a lot of work on Photuris. And Photuris is really present in late May to late June in Texas, but also in your area as well, occur from May to July. And they're very large fireflies, and they also have the femme fatale fireflies that are in this particular genus. And these are Photuris that mimic the flash pattern of other species. And they do this to get steroid-like compounds called lucibafagins. And these are what makes them poisonous to predators. So birds and bats and other things that might want to eat them. This is kind of what one looks like up close. You can see they kind of, look at big, kind of the mandibles, basically, very developed legs. They're kind of hunchbacked. So sometimes we call these big, scary predator fireflies. Occasionally, I'll catch one and put one in my fingers, and I'll be like, it's going to bite me. And then a couple seconds later, it bites me. Now, it doesn't really, just more like a pinch, but these are predatory fireflies. This is an example of what one looks like flying over in a habitat. And this is a long exposure video that's been stacked. Those videos, basically each layer has been stacked on top of each other to create this image. And it's very cool. It just shows Photuris basically flying over the treetops and doing a variety of different things here. This is a species that occurs in your area, not this specific species, but it's called something else, Phyturus frontalis. And it is a species that's also known to synchronize its flash. It's the gentler Phyturus, we like to call it. And it has like kind of a double flicker flash that's very unique. So this is really fun. What is one of the most complicated firefly flash patterns in the United States right now? And I thought this was kind of just a fun thing. We've looked at some other fireflies that just flash every couple seconds, but this guy, these have really kind of gone very far off. This is what a flash pattern for Phyturus waldoxi looks like, and you can see it is a period of 5 flash train, and then a glow, plus 2 extra pulses, and then another glow. And so a lot of interesting things happen in the animal kingdom, like birds of paradise, and complicated mating displays. And it occurs also with fireflies as well. And some extra sexual selection has driven males in order to display these very exotic flash pattern displays, and makes it a really easy, interesting thing to see when you see in public or out in the field. This was identified by Lynn Faust, occurs in kind of the swamps of Mississippi, maybe East Texas. There's another species that's similar, and just a unique kind of flash train. The species identification for fireflies like this in areas that don't get a lot of protection, like Mississippi, for example, it's really valuable for the local community. And so try to support this as much as possible, because it gives it creates importance for these habitats that otherwise might be not as appreciated. These are some other species in Texas that are interesting that also occur in your area. Pleiotomus pallens occurs in your area. It's also called Pleiotomus davis. And then some interesting things from Mexico. This was a firefly down in the right-hand corner that somebody on iNaturalist reported. And it was a genus that had only been seen in Texas 4 times since 1935, at least recorded. And so it made for a very rare combination, a sighting, basically. So the power of iNaturalist is very powerful. In fact, I just posted on my website a guide for firefly sightings, and I recommend people to post photos on iNat if you can. It's very helpful for us, and especially in your own backyard, record what you can. And that's it. Thank you for attending, and consider supporting firefly conservation by purchasing a certified firefly sign or making a donation on the website. I do not do this necessarily for money or as a job. This is only on my spare time, and any donations go towards science programming for kids, specifically for the firefly walks I do in the spring to buy vials and stuff, and to keep the website up. And that is it. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining today and on this Sunday. And I hope the rest of you all have a good Super Bowl. I'm going to go ahead and answer some questions here that are in the chat. So if you've got any that you'd like.
I was going to say, Ben, I'm going to pause you for just a second.
Okay.
So I'm going to do some announcements. Oh, okay. Well, y'all can see me, right? So I'm going to give folks a chance to pop their questions in the Q&A tab. Not just the chat, and then of course let y'all formulate your own questions, and we'll ask them on your behalf, or y'all can ask them because I got the mic here. But while we're doing that, I want to thank y'all again for joining us today. One of the best ways you can make sure we have programs like this is through membership, and you can find out more about that at bhwp.org/join. And I talk about membership and the importance. We try to make it worth our members' while. One of the best benefits, I think, of membership is the fact that we waive our admission fee for members. So if you're visiting the preserve and like to hike and don't want to pay admission fees, if you come more than, I think, 4 times a year, 5 times a year, what you would have paid for admission is covered by your membership. And membership also gets you discounts on programming like this, stuff in the shop, our nursery sales floor. There's a whole bunch of things. So we really do try to make it worth our members' while. Some upcoming programs that you might be interested in, of course, our winter lecture series will continue on next weekend with discovering caterpillars. And then finally, it'll end up on February 26th with our last one. It's hard to believe we're closing up the winter lecture series already. That was fast. But that will be distilling flavor and aromatics of native plants in cocktails. Woo! There'll not be cocktails here for y'all. Sorry. That'll be something for when you go home. Of course, our Knowing Native Plants series will continue on March 4th with Trees in Winter, followed by Signs of Spring on March 25th. I cannot believe we're already in Signs of Spring. And then this week, one of the big programs we've got is our Land Ethics Symposium, which has a super scary name, but think of it like a collaboration or culmination of 4 amazing speakers, jam-packed all in one day. And that'll be February 16th from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. This year's symposium speakers, I am so thrilled. I've already had a chance to hear all the speakers talk. They are fantastic. Paul Chukey, who you might know that name of, he wrote the Organic Land Care Guide. He was also on HGTV, but he is currently the Director of Environmental Stewardship at Glenstone Museum. He'll be joining us for the art of creating a regenerative landscape from the ground up. Matthew Benzie, who's president and owner of Indigenous Ingenuity, so a local land firm from Doylestown, who's going to talk about highly skilled landscape maintenance. We've got Samir Dalal from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and he is the Land Care Program Manager, and he's going to discuss the Revitalizing the Vacant Lot gardening program for greater good with native plants. And then lastly, we've got Jeff Lorenz, who's founder of Refugia, and he's going to talk about planting a new paradigm, which discusses the science of and the monitoring aspects of these native plants and how they've affected the landscape. So lots upcoming for the preserve, and hopefully y'all can join us. Now, housekeeping out of the way, let's take it over to some questions. And so, Ben, I know that you can see the chat, but not everyone here can see the chat. So just so that we can have recording, I'll be asking the questions from the Q&A tab, just so they're vocalized for everyone. Okay. We'll do a Q&A. We can start off with Catherine's first question is the larvae. Can you remind us again what the larvae are eating and where we can find them?
Yeah, good question. So the larvae eat snails and slugs and earthworms, essentially. Typically, large earthworms were kind of introduced into North America, so they historically likely ate small native species. But firefly larvae will basically eat like also decaying snails. I've seen photos of like larvae that crawl out into a road to eat, like run over snails, for example. So they basically will eat a lot of things. Photinus, for example, species lives in the mud. So it eats insects that kind of live in the mud and the topsoil layer.
Fantastic. And then, Bill, how do they modulate their flashing?
Good question. So they modulate the flashing by the oxygen that they breathe in, basically, and that's how they control it. So they have pits basically in their underside of their abdomen, and that's where the oxygen is taken in. When they breathe in that oxygen, it charges up that luciferin molecule, and they do it relatively very quickly. That's how they kind of modulate the flashing in that way. If there's a lack of oxygen or it's been used already, then they're not going to flash. Now, obviously, there's connection between like the insect brain and then like what they're doing to do that kind of flashing, but it's instinctual.
All right, very cool. Questions from our live audience. Yeah, we got one in the back. Miss Jean, go ahead.
What is the point of mimicking other species?
Great question. So Photurus will mimic the other species to draw in males of other species to eat them, essentially. Interestingly enough, if you see and it's the females that are doing this, not the males of Photurus, the femme fatale females, I guess you could say. It's kind of curious when you try to find males of the species that eats other fireflies, they're very timid and scared, basically. They'll like peer around a leaf almost, like they're hiding from you. And it's because they could get eaten by their own kind, essentially. So Dr. Eisner was a well-known entomologist, and he was able to record up to 13 different flash patterns that some of these futurists could mimic, basically. So they could mimic up to 13 different species, essentially, or different types of flash patterns. So yeah, great question. Some species basically just use a 1 second flash, basically, and kind of interval flash to kind of mimic another one. Males are very eager to mate, and so they're kind of gullible, I guess you could say, for this. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing that they're able to do this.
Are they mimicking, are they doing this for food, or are they doing it to mess with the other species?
Yeah, they're doing it for one really sole reason, is to obtain the compounds that make the other species poisonous. And they need these compounds in order to give those compounds called lucibefagans to their eggs, essentially, so their eggs don't get eaten. So the female futurist that is predatory, she wants to eat other species that naturally make those compounds because she doesn't make it on her own. She makes one version of the compound, but not a complete spectrum of it. And so this is one of the ways that she ensures that her eggs don't get eaten in the soil, is by eating the other fireflies that make it, and then basically giving those compounds to her eggs.
I have a question about the blue flashing butterflies in the lower Appalachian Mountains in South Carolina and North Carolina.
Okay,
up
yeah.
in the Boone County. People come, what I've read is they come from all over to see them, but what makes them flash blue?
Those are, okay, so that's Phosphus, I think reticulata, Inasansa, and those are called the blue ghost fireflies. I believe that's what she's referring to. And they actually don't make blue light, believe it or not. And so it is actually kind of a very weak, kind of yellowish or greenish color, that's very, very weak, essentially. And to our eyes, it looks blue, but it's really not blue from all the research that I've read. It's just kind of very close and very, very weak. When I remember when I talked in the presentation about what you see can kind of vary based on the flashes that you see. And since that light is so weak, it kind of just your eyes just don't pick it up. So now an interesting story. Scientists for the last 30 years have been trying to identify an organic compound that makes blue light naturally. They were able to make this blue light with LEDs, but it took them 30 years to figure that out, for example. That's why in the 1960s and 70s, you didn't have blue LEDs around, is because they still didn't figure out how to do it. It took them 30 years to figure that out. The next task was trying to find organics that made blue light, and they still haven't found it. So if you want to be a billionaire, figure out how to make blue light organically. Yeah, blue light in the animal kingdom, as far as I understand, does not exist. And there's a couple scientists that have been on the hunt for it for many, many years, and nobody's found it.
So, question, you talked about synchrony in firefly species. What is the, I would say, benefit? Why are they performing these light flashes all as a giant group?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's one that kind of can be tricky to answer because we don't really know 100%. But what the thought is that when the synchrony happens, one male is basically responding to the flash of another male in basically nanosecond time frame. Now, the synchronous firefly in Tennessee, Photinus carolinus, does this so remarkably well that it doesn't look like there's any delay between the two, but it's almost like near complete perfect synchrony. In Malaysia, for example, where the synchronous fireflies occur as well, you can imagine that hundreds of thousands of them in a tree basically flash, pulsing, basically like that. What it is that it's the males basically all want to signal to a female, and they have figured out, or just instinctually, that the brighter they are, basically, the more females will come out and signal to them, as opposed to just being one here and there, essentially. So in some ways, they're competing with each other, but they're also working in tandem in order to signal to females to impress them. A female might look within that spectrum of synchrony, and they might see a male or two that they might really like, for example. Females are extremely choosy. There can be times where they don't even want to, like, they won't even flash back if they don't like what they see. And so that choosiness is what's driven males to use this synchrony, basically, to kind of act like it's a giant spotlight, like, hello, look at me, kind of sort of deal. So we still are not 100% sure of how and why it all happens in certain species. In Mexico, for example, there are some firefly species that synchronize their flash that are just absolutely incredible while they're flying around, just blow your mind kind of stuff. And we've got that here in the United States too. But yeah, it's very interesting, the synchronous.
Mary Beth had a question here and was wondering, how far from water source do they need?
Yeah, that's going to vary on per species. And it just depends. Some occur in a very narrow area, like corridor, essentially, that are very dependent upon moisture. Others can survive in more xeric habitat. Now, Photinus pyralis, the common type of firefly that I mentioned that you have, it's very adaptable. So it can occur in your backyard. I've seen them in Walmart parking lots, for example, outside Starbucks. So, they can adapt to pretty robust areas. But in terms of distance, I would say, like maybe 50 meters, or 30 yards, basically 30 to 50 yards, basically, is generally kind of where you'll find them.
All right. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, will the female mate with more than one male? And does she lay more than one brood of eggs, or what's her?
Yeah, that's
history?
that's a really, really good question, because that's so the female will mate with multiple males, and it just depends on species, of course. But copulation lasts for 1 hour to 12 hours, for example. And she's a lot of times just doing this in order to ensure, survival of offspring, essentially, the best chance. We still don't know for some species, if she'll mate with multiple males, but generally they will do that. And then she'll lay eggs actually in more than one area, if possible. Over a period of 2 weeks, for example, she might lay eggs in like 5 spots.
I have a question. What do mature fireflies eat? And if it's vegetation, is any of the vegetation host specific? A lot of the insects, of course, are, host specific as far as plants. And that's, of course, one of the huge benefits of having native vegetation.
Yeah, good question. So as adults, they really don't eat. And they will drink like maybe some nectar or some dew from a plant, for example, for moisture. When I keep them in captivity, let's say they're in my house or something in a jar, I feed them apple slices, and that sustains them for a while. But they don't really they won't eat much else, basically. They don't have mandibles. Some of the species don't have mandibles to chew anything, essentially. So they don't eat. Now, in terms of plant associations or host specific plant associations, there really isn't too many like very concrete associations with plants in a certain species. Now they have, you think about it like certain species have grown or evolved with certain plants in their local area. So there are certain plants that do benefit fireflies. For example, tall bushy grasses near a riparian area provide really good hiding places. But in terms of those host specific associations with like a flower type or pollen or nectar, something like that, really doesn't exist. And there's still lacking research in that area, actually.
All right. Do we notice any effect on the color of flashing and the diversity of flash patterns?
The color of flashing and the diversity of flash patterns in relation to,
like, does green have more flash patterns versus the amber versus, or it?
okay, yeah. So those colors are dependent on the genus specifically. So there's probably more fireflies that have a yellowish green flash than there are amber, for example, but this is going to vary per habitat. And if you're along the coastal region, for example, you're going to see more pyractomina, like here in Texas, for example, and that will be more amber flashes. Yellow green for Photinus and Photurus, and then other genuses are more common. So yeah, there's more yellow greenish flashing.
Very cool. Thank you.
I like to know, where do fireflies lay their eggs, and what does the egg look like? Is it discrete, or they come in a group, in a patch?
Yeah, so fireflies will lay their eggs in mud, essentially. And some species will lay it in leaf litter. And generally areas that have a good access to the soil layer, essentially. So there's moisture there. Some might be underneath like rocks, for example, as well, at the base of vegetation. And so, yeah, generally, depending upon the species, generally in mud or some kind of soil layer that's loose enough for them to crawl in there. Now, the egg is basically just a round egg, essentially, that includes like a small larva inside that grows over a period of a couple weeks. And so nothing particularly special about that egg, really. But yeah, just no weird shape or anything like that, just round.
All right, and then last one here we've got is from Heidi. Can you discuss climate change and the impacts that it's having on firefly ranges and how, you know, the populations are changing?
Yeah, so regarding climate change, some areas are experiencing warmer climates, and then some are experiencing colder climates, actually, in response to climate change. And so what this is affecting fireflies is the emergence time with certain fireflies. In places like Texas here, we have kind of unpredictable weather at times. You know, one year it's snowing, the next year it's 105 degrees. And so the species here is adapted to these kind of wild swings a little bit better than stuff up in the Northeast, that you'll have a pronounced firefly season that occurs in July, for example, and it lasts for 2 weeks. Now, the seasonality with climate change is that as things get hotter and there's more sunlight, basically this raises the time when fireflies emerge. Okay, so if things get hotter and hotter and hotter, you might have fireflies that emerge in mid-June as opposed to mid-July. And then one of the other effects is that with hotter temperatures, what it does is it evaporates moisture a lot quicker. And so that creates habitat that is drier, that certain species may not be able to survive in. And so I talked about aquifer decline in the presentation, and that's kind of one of the things. But yeah, interesting story, brief one, just to kind of make you think a little bit. There's speculation that there's fireflies that occur in Washington, for example, and also in British Columbia. There's documented fireflies in British Columbia. Now, there is a railroad that runs from British Columbia all the way to Alaska. And over the period of the last like 30, 40 years, or actually longer than that, the fireflies have been working up that railroad corridor up towards Alaska. So the theory is that in 150 years, there could potentially be fireflies in Alaska, where there's none now. So things have gotten a little warmer, and they've been migrating up that railroad. So just kind of a cool little story, but
That's mind-blowing. All right, friends. Well, that takes us out of time for today's program. I want to thank each and every one of you who's joining us virtually for coming today. I want to thank all my friends who joined us here in person for today. Thank y'all. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Ben for taking time out of his day to join us. This was amazing. Friends, please help yourselves to cookie and coffee on the way out. Enjoy the big game if sports ball is your thing. Hooray for some birdies. And as always, keep on experiencing what's natural and learn what's native. Take care.